Hi, hello. We are here talking with Deepa Anappara on her debut novel, Patrula on the Purple Line, which was translated in Romania, Patrula, djinnilor, and was published in the Anansi collection. Hi, Deepa, welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be speaking to you.
It was a great joy to read your novel. I was in the beginning. I was very intrigued by the context and by the voice of the little boy, the story of the little boy. But then, as I went further with my reading, I saw that there is so much more into the novel. I must confess, without giving any details to the readers, that I was very saddened towards the end. But I did understand your reason, so maybe we will talk about it in the interview. But I was waiting as I was reading. I was waiting that some good news will be brought about the children. So without giving any other information, I would like to ask you to invite you to tell us a little bit about your novel, about the story and how you came about the story.
So this is, I used to work as a journalist in India for over a decade. And during that time, I came across neighborhoods, impoverished neighborhoods like the one I've written about in the novel, where 20 or 30 children had gone missing over 2 or 3 years. And no effort had been made to find them because, they were from poor families, and typically poor families don't have any money or influence. So the police and the politicians, they found it really easy to ignore them. So there were these neighborhoods where, parents had no idea where their children were. And so I used to interview children at that time because I was reporting on education. So my interest was really in their responses to these disappearances of their friends. And I was interested in finding out how they made sense of, their siblings or their friends disappearing, and how they themselves, what sort of narrative did they craft to sort of handle this really difficult situation? And how did they understand it with that sort of, because, their perspective of the world is limited because they're quite young and they can't really understand what is actually happening. So how did they make sense of that? And I thought that I would write a long form piece about it, interviewing the children, a narrative journalism essentially. But my life changed and I ended up moving away from India to the UK, but the idea stayed with me. And I tried to explore it through fiction, but it took me a really long time to find Jay's voice, and he was essentially my way into the story. So essentially, Jin Patrol on the Purple Line, it is a part coming of age story and a part detective novel about 3 children who are looking for their missing friends in an unnamed, impoverished neighborhood in North India. And it's mostly told through the point of view of Jay, and he's 9 years old, and he thinks he's a detective because he watches a lot of cop shows on TV, and he thinks he can solve this case of the missing children. And he's helped by 2 of his friends, Pari and Faiz. And so together the 3 children set out on what they think is a grand adventure. But then events take a sinister turn, and as the disappearances edge closer to home. One of the things, like you said, obviously it's a story about a tragedy and how that tragedy impacts this community, which is quite vulnerable and neglected by society at large. And so for me, it was really important to write the story in a way so that the characters would come across as characters and they wouldn't be defined solely by their very difficult circumstances. And so for me, capturing the children's voices and, from my own experience, what I've seen is that they don't really see themselves as victims, and, they can be quite sarcastic, they can be quite brutal in how they speak to you, and they also have a sense of humor. So I tried to capture that through their voices in the novel. So hopefully when people read it, it's not sort of a relentless tragedy, which is not how anyone views their own lives. So there are also, the children also have the ability to find happiness, and I hope that comes across as well.
In my opinion, you did a magnificent voice in rendering Jay's voice, but also of the other, the girl and the boy, Faiz and Pari. Jay is a wonderful little boy who is indeed he has a very strong imagination. He's very playful as well, and in their quarrels and their discussions, they are very authentic, and in the midst of the tragedy, they actually bring a lot of life and a lot of resilience. I think you managed that we don't see them as victims, although they live this in horrific conditions and in a tragedy. And I think you also managed to not to make the other characters like fathers, the parents that we see, or the street vendors. They are not just sketches, but you can see the life within them, and they have their own stories. And I think you did a great job in having compassion for all the characters involved. I was reading that you started writing it more seriously during a creative writing. So if you can tell us a little bit also of your process of documenting it, although you had a journalistic background, but if you did some other research for the book.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. It's a relief to hear that, you don't, when you read the book, you don't see them as victims. And that was something that I really worried about, and which is why it took me a really long time to be able to write the book. So when I first started writing it, it was, I think, in 2009, and I just joined an evening creative writing course in London. But I quickly realized that, all these were, there's a lot of ethical questions that you have to consider before you write a story like this, because it's about a marginalized, vulnerable community whose voices you don't normally see because of, various structural inequities. So I had to be really I had to really consider those questions. Can I write this story? Because this is a real problem that people in India are still living with. The number is that about 180 children disappear each day. So it's a huge, unimaginable number, really. So for me, just figuring, how to write this story respectfully and by being true to, what is really happening, it took me a long time to figure that out. So when I joined this MA, I think almost sort of 7 or 8 years after that, it's a master's in creative writing, and I wrote it for my dissertation as a thesis for the MA. This is, I relied quite a lot on what I'd learned as a journalist, because over almost a decade, more than a decade, I used to visit these neighborhoods. And, the people I met were very generous almost all the time. They would invite me inside, they would give me tea and talk to me about what was happening in their lives. So I did have, I think I did have sort of that background information which I needed about what lives were like in those neighborhoods and how people saw themselves. So that, so I already had, I think all those years as a journalist was essentially the most of the research. But beyond that, I did talk to various charities who work with children, especially children in neighborhoods like these. And I spoke to policemen about how they go about trying to solve the disappearances. The kind of technology that they use these days to solve these cases. And I read quite a lot of books, on my website. I've actually put a short, brief bibliography of the books and the articles that I'd consulted. And these are essentially by researchers into these areas. For instance, how do women occupy spaces in an impoverished neighborhood? So those sorts of studies I found were really useful in giving me a broader perspective. So that was essentially my process of research. I think I relied quite a lot on my memories and of interviewing children and what they were like in writing this novel. Yeah.
As you mentioned the memory, actually I was thinking of how many flavors are in the book, and how much you managed to give such a thick color to everything, and as almost we are there. So although the book is mainly in a slum in India, we see a lot of cooking, lots of taste of flavor. So you don't see that. You also see the poverty and the inequalities, but there is also a lot of human kindness and a lot of richness in a way. Especially in the family relationships. I ask you of the research because I thought, and you can argue if you can disagree with me. I saw that it's a big step from writing in a journalistic manner to fiction, and that you managed to do it in such a beautiful way. So I was curious if it was very difficult for you to find, for instance, Jay's voice. If you had one moment when you said, "Oh, this is how he speaks, and this is how he has all these games in his mind and all his imagination in his mind."
I mean, it was really difficult for me to switch from being a journalist to writing fiction. Because I trained as a journalist. I never studied literature or writing, so I had no idea how to write fiction. It was something, obviously I read quite a lot of books from the time I was a child, and I wanted to write fiction, but it was not something that I had studied. So my knowledge about writing creatively was quite limited. And one of the challenges that for me when I tried to write fiction after moving to this country, which is the UK, was that I found it really difficult to, sort of trust my imagination. I wanted to be sure that this road exists in this place, and I had a correct map. And I think it's quite difficult to write fiction in that way, because as a journalist, I had been trained to be quite objective. So, I put myself out of the story and I just present facts, and then the reader can form their opinion by reading an article. So that's how I'd been trained as a reporter. But it's not something that can work in fiction, because fiction is all about inhabiting a particular character's perspective. And so you have to view the world as they view it. And so, I might disagree with how Jay sees women or girls, and because he's also a product of this very conservative society. But I have to be true to his vision. And that really took me a long time to learn to sort of see the world as a character sees it. And so, which is a very subjective perspective. And just learning how to do that took me quite a long time. And, in the years in which I wasn't working on this novel, but it was there in the back of my mind, I was reading books with child narrators, like Paddy Clark, Roddy Doyle's Booker Prize-winning novel, lots of other books which had child narrators. And also, I watched a lot of films with child protagonists. And I wrote short stories from the point of view of a child. So it was, I think by the time I sat down to write this novel, I had some form of idea about the technique involved in writing from a child's point of view. And so, so I just had this idea that I knew that it was going to be a boy and a girl, and it would be like a Sherlock Holmes, Watson kind of story where the boy thinks he's Sherlock, but actually he isn't bright enough to be one.
He's not the assistant.
Yeah, it's not. It's not. So I just had, that's all I knew when I sat down to write the story, and that's essentially my process. I don't really like, I know some writers prefer to work out everything before they sit down to write, but I don't do that. And for me, it's just, it's by writing that I learn more about the characters. So when I wrote the first paragraph, because he's doing a headstand in the very first sentence, and I realized he has this sort of very topsy-turvy view of the world, and it's not how a normal person wouldn't look at the world that way. He has a very unique way perspective. So I knew that about him, and I also realized, because he thinks there is a jinn, he imagines a jinn, which is a spirit, watching him from the roof. So I realized, oh right, this is a boy who believes in jinns, and so then I had to sort of work out, where does that belief come from? It comes from, his community. And so that was essentially my process. I was learning about them as I was writing. So for me, the first draft is really about finding out more about the characters and about the story. And, it's only in editing and revisions that I think about other aspects of the novel. Yeah.
Actually, I wanted to ask you about the genes, but before going to that, just to remind everyone, so it's a 3-part novel, and the story is, yes, that in a community, in a poor community, there is a string of disappearance from children, and these 3 little boys, the 2 boys and the girl, start to play the detectives and to try to solve the mystery. As you mentioned, one of the explanation of the main character of Jace is that one of the genes, or an evil gene, took the children. And I was a little bit curious about this mythical character. Maybe you can let us know here in Romania a little bit about its importance in the Indian culture. And also, there are 2 other spirits which are important in the book. I read the book in Romanian, so I don't know the exact original name, but one is taking care of the street children, and the other one is especially of the girls and young women. And they are very powerfully depicted. So maybe if you can also tell us a little bit about these ghosts and spirits and their place.
So, I mean, those were not the chapters that I had written first. So first it was Jai's voice, and it was from his voice that I knew that he lives in a community and he himself believes in ghosts and spirits. And also it was something that came from, again, the work that I had done as a reporter, because especially when, in the case, for instance, of street children, and because they don't have the support structures that, children who are parents have, they tend to believe in ghosts. And so there's a sense that they're guardian angels, or they're being protected by ghosts. So it was something that used to come up in during, when I was talking to children. And so it was I realized that especially when you don't have much power, and when you don't get the support, say, of government or family, or all these institutions that are supposed to protect you, like politicians and police, and so you're being ignored by all these structures which are explicitly meant to look after you, but they're ignoring you. Then people tend to sort of turn to the supernatural in the belief that there might be just some sort of divine intervention and for protection. So at least that was my understanding of this kind of belief system in ghosts and spirits. So I wanted the book to reflect that, because it's very common in especially if you're sort of being left to your own devices in a very difficult situation, such as when children are disappearing. You often turn to sages or to spirits, to ghosts. So I wanted the book to reflect that, which is why it has 3 mythical stories. And one is a story about a ghost who looks after children who are essentially on the street. And that's the story with which the book begins. Then there's a story about a ghost of a woman who's meant to protect women and girls. And the last story is about jinns. So jinns are essentially spirits who it's believed that, especially in Islam, it's believed that it's created by Allah, and that jinns can be good or bad. So Jay's belief is that a bad jinn is snatching the children, and but there are also areas or parts where people worship jinns, and they are believed to be good jinns who will grant your wishes. So essentially, the American term genie, and popularized in Hollywood, it comes from the jinn. Except that the jinn is also a fearful creature in Indian mythology. And there are actually areas in Delhi where jinns are believed to reside. And that particular story is based on a real place in Delhi where people, it's a sort of not abandoned, but a fort in ruins where people go and leave messages for jinns saying, please give me this. And the belief is that the jinns will read it overnight and grant you your wishes. So it's based on a real story. So, like all of the book, everything in it is has some sort of root in reality. And so I don't know if you have jinns in Romania, or
we do have a sort of ghosts, strigoi it's called, that are sort of dead or dead alive, and that's the basis for the vampires, like and we have some sort of evil fairies, like women that can make a man get mad if he looks at them.
Okay.
Yeah, so we do have, but not the jinn exactly.
Okay. Yeah, jinns are quite common in the Arab world, and in India and parts of South Asia.
You mentioned I will go a little bit to another layer, but because actually the book has so many layers and it's so rich in reflection and in content. So there is a very strong underlining social commentary. So you do have a sort of religious conflicts, and it was beautifully rendered this tension, how it builds up and how it just the sparks and how it makes everything go ablaze at a certain point. You do have the police that seems very corrupted, and actually at a certain point you have this interesting word game like police and life, that is from the same word. And of course you have the social inequalities with these big communities, gated communities next to very difficult slum. And I was asking myself when I was reading, how do you think the literature can have an impact? So what would you expect, or what would you hope from a reader to take from especially from the commentary, the social commentary, by reading the book?
So I wasn't really so much thinking about depicting social issues when I was writing the novel, even though that was, the motivation definitely came from that. So once you start writing, you have to really just be true to the characters and just only look at, what the characters notice. So for instance, for Jay, the fact that he has to stand in a line to use the toilets, it's not a big thing for him. Or the fact that they have to queue to collect water. So he just considers those as, it's normal in his life. And so I did want to portray that only as, he experiences it. So unlike his mother and sister, he doesn't have to go and stand in a line to collect the water. So, he doesn't find it a bit troubling. But I think at the same time, I did want to be true to what that experience is. So even if as a child, he doesn't realize the difficulty of that situation in which, he and just the unfairness of how they have to live. He doesn't realize that But my hope was that as an adult reader, an adult reader would be able to read between the lines and, take that knowledge away from what he describes. There's always, I think, a gap between in the narration when it is told from the point of view of a child, because the child doesn't understand everything that he or she is seeing. But I think the adult reader can, pick up the hints and get a larger picture or a broader picture of what is actually happening. So that was really my hope in writing the book. And so I just wanted to be true to what Jay or any of the characters would see. And hopefully that a larger picture would emerge for the reader from, the details that they do notice. So he tends to notice what he wants to eat or animals, because those are the things that he is interested in. But just within those descriptions, my hope was that the reader would be able to see that it is really inequitable sort of situation, and that it's quite unfair and difficult. I think one of the things that you always struggle, especially as an Indian writing about India, is that, I didn't want to feed into these sort of narratives about India, which are there in the West. And, oftentimes there's a tendency to sort of make it easily digestible for the Western reader, so that, the Western reader doesn't have to do much work to understand what's going on. And that's often by just painting things sort of black and white, which is not how it is in real life. So I just, I think what I tried to do was to portray the reality in all its complexity. And I just thought, if a Western reader doesn't understand it, then I just had to be true to myself and true to, what the situation really is in India, and which is that there's all this religious conflict, and you can see it playing out right now, which is that there is a pandemic raging, and there is a huge Hindu festival, which the government has not stopped, because it's, its entire reason for existence is that it says India is a country for Hindus. So it will not say anything. It will not step in to stop a Hindu festival, but it has done so several times in the past year. It stepped in to stop Muslims from celebrating festivals. And in fact, when the pandemic started, it blamed a congregation of people who were praying at a mosque for spreading coronavirus across the country. So it's something that, unfortunately, this is what the government has been doing, and people are voting on the basis of, this fear that the government has been creating. And so you find that the minority community is being blamed for absolutely ridiculous things, So in the book, you can see that when the disappearances happen, the tendency is to blame Muslims, which is something that you're seeing, even today in India. So it was just, for me, it was, it's not so much social commentary as, unfortunately, what is really happening. It's just, the reality. So if you're a poor person living in a neighborhood like Jay's, you can't sort of avoid all this sort of, religious discrimination on the basis of caste, which is happening. Whereas you can protect yourself to a certain extent if you're well off and you live in a gated community, you can sort of, close the doors and protect yourself. But you can't do that when, as a child, or, if you're living in a neighborhood like Jay's, there's no way to avoid the reality of what's actually happening around you. Yeah.
I just wanted to, I think you, for a non-Indian reader like myself, you managed to show this a very complex situation, very complex characters with good and bad parts. We see that the inequalities, like Jay, although he's a very courageous young boy, he has some differences in treating his sister, or so it's very human, everything that you portray there. I just wanted, we are towards the end of the interview, and I just want the readers to know that it's, although it has this heavy topics. It's a very light and joyful reading. Like my experience was very pleasant. And I would ask you two more questions. One is related to the end, and to the fact that throughout the novel we see this smog, it's very heavy, and that covers the sky. And we see Jay, who really wants to see the sky and the stars. And in the end, you have this sort of hopeful, and he does see the sky. So if you can tell us a little bit about the importance of the smoke, and how you decide that was the perfect ending for the novel.
So again, the smog is unfortunately a reality in North India come winter. So once it's sort of November, you can't see anything until, you know, February or March. So the book takes place across 4 months when the smog is quite strong. But also once I started writing, you know, I knew that it would be integral to the story, in the sense that it had metaphorically also, it speaks to how, you know, the children don't know what's happening. Nobody is actually can see what is going on. So I felt that, so apart from being true to that, you know, the time of that year when there is a smog, it also had another role in terms of describing how everything is sort of obscured in that world. Yeah, so it was, I think I was also thinking of these sort of detective novels in, or Sherlock Holmes in, you know, when there is a smog in London as well, sort of that time. And also, I mean, I wrote it before the pandemic, but especially in Delhi, you see a lot of people wearing masks during winter to protect themselves from pollution. And I felt that, you know, it was an additional layer of threat, because you can't really see who's the person behind, you know, what mask they're wearing. So it felt, so for me, it was a sort of good device to use to convey the threat and that essential sense that no one can see where this is going. I think for me, the ending came quite, it was quite organic, you know, it wasn't really planned. As I wrote that paragraph, I knew, you know, that was sort of the ending for the book. There was some back and forth during the editing process, and there was, I think there was some discussion about the ending being different to perhaps appeal to many more readers. But for me, it was really important to be truthful to what's really happening in India, and truthful to the experiences of the people who are actually going through these things. And I felt that that was more important than, you know, being truthful to people who have actually experienced these disappearances was more important than, you know, how a reader would feel at the end of the book. So yeah, I felt that this was an ending that was true to both Jay and how he sees the world, and also true to the experiences of the community that I've written about.
Yeah, I saw that it's really the perfect ending. So the last question is about, it's for the Romanian readers. What are you working next? So what should we expect as the next translation from you?
It's likely going to be a long time away. But yeah, I am working on another novel. It's just too early to say anything about it. But yeah, fingers crossed, yeah.
Okay, then I will just let the readers know that you have a webpage, and you can. It's also written the webpage by the end of the book that you can read, and also there are some so they can look for you and for your next books there.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you so much for the interview and for letting us know about this great novel.
Thank you so much for the great questions. You know, it's always a pleasure to meet anyone who has read the book and understood it in the spirit in which I wrote it, which is, it doesn't happen often. So this is great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.